Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. Welcome to Bud Mouse. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting history. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story.
Morning, baby bear. This is a long one. Are you ready? Here we go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. This shout out is for our friend. Hang on, I forgot to grab my microphone. A moment. Keith, okay, perfect. We saw PPS, that is paranormal session shorts or something along those lines. I think I'm not good with that. Okay. Paranormal Short Sessions by Keith Evans. He basically does a lot of spirit box sessions in graveyards. So if you're into graveyards, paranormal, spirits, check them out. Like, share, comment, let them know we saw it. Bye, have a good day.
Hold on, there we go. All right, peoples, get all your pillows and blankets and David, Joe, the blah, 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 blah. Somebody's going to tell us a story whose name I can't remember. Go for it. I'm not tired. Nope. This is
the bearded historian and the sleepy wifey. Anyway.
I know what's going on.
She knows what's going on.
Totally.
She's so ready for this. She's ready to go to sleep. Anyway, today we're gonna have a little trip back into the past. A lot of times when I talk about history, we usually talk about going from point A to point B. Sometimes it might be something simple like halfway across the state. This time we're going to stretch it out just a little bit.
A little bit?
Just a little bit. Now, back in 1803, Thomas Jefferson made a simple plan. He asked Lewis and Clark to go and explore the Missouri River, principal stream of it, its course and communication with the waters of the Pacific Ocean, whether the Columbia, Oregon, Colorado, or other river may offer the more direct or practical water communication across the continent for purposes of commerce. Now, Lewis and Clark found a path to the Pacific Ocean. It wasn't until 1859 that a direct and more practical route, the Mullen Road, connected the Missouri River to the Columbia River. Now, that first land route across the present-day continental United States was mapped by Lewis and Clark's expedition between 1804 and 1806. Lewis and Clark believed they had found a practical overland route to the west coast. However, the two passes that they found going through the Rocky Mountains, Lemo Pass and Lolo Pass, turned out to be too much difficult for prairie schooner wagons to pass through without considerable road work. On that return trip in 1806, they traveled from the Columbia River to the Snake River, and then to the Clearwater River over Lolo Pass again, and then they traveled overland up the Blackfoot River and crossed the Continental Divide at the Lewis and Clark Pass. Gee, what a name. As it would become known, and then on to the head of the Missouri River. This was ultimately a shorter and faster route than the one that they had followed west. This route had its disadvantages as being too rough for wagons and controlled by the Blackfoot tribes. Even though Lewis and Clark had only traveled a narrow portion of the upper Missouri River drainage and part of the Columbia River drainage, they were considered the two major rivers draining most of the Rocky Mountains, and the expedition confirmed that there was no easy route through the northern Rocky Mountains as Jefferson had hoped. Nonetheless, the famous expedition had mapped both the eastern and western river valleys, the Platte and Snake Rivers, that bookend the route of the Oregon Trail. and other immigrant trails across the Continental Divide, and they had not located the South Pass or some of the interconnecting valleys later used in the high country. They did show the way, however, for mountain men, who within a decade would find a better way across, even if it was not to be an easy way. Well, a name that became familiar, John Jacob Astor, was a subsidiary of the American Fur Company. In 1810, he developed the Pacific Fur Company, operating in the Pacific Northwest for the ongoing North American fur trade. The two movements of the PFC employees were planned by Astor. One detachment he sent to the Columbia River by the Tonquin, and the other overland under an expedition led by Wilson Price Hunt. Hunt and the party were able to find possible supply routes and trapping territories for further fur trading posts. Upon arriving at the river in March 1811, the Tonquin crew began construction of what became Fort Astoria. The ship left supplies and men to continue working on the station and ventured north up the coast to Clayoquot Sound for a trading expedition. While anchored there, Jonathan Thorne insulted an elder who had previously elected by the natives to negotiate a mutually satisfactory price for animal pelts. Soon after, the vessel was attacked and overwhelmed by the indigenous Clayoquot, killing many of the crew. And Quincal interpreter survived and later told the PFC management at Fort Astoria of the destruction. The next day, this ship was blown up by surviving crew members. Under Hunt, fearing attack by the Nissapi, the overland expedition veered south of Lewis and Clark's route into what is now Wyoming, and in the process passed across Union Pass and into Jackson Hole, Wyoming. From there, they went down over the Teton Range via the Teton Pass, and there down into the Snake River in modern Idaho. They abandoned their horses at the Snake River, made dugout canoes, and then attempted to use the river for transport. After a few days' travel, they soon discovered that the steep canyons, waterfalls, and impassable rapids made travel by river impossible. Too far for their horses to be retrieved, they had to cache most of their goods and walk the rest of the way to the Columbia River, where they made new boats and traveled to the newly established Fort Astoria. This expedition demonstrated that much of the route along the Snake River Plain and across the Columbia was passable by pack train with minimal improvements, even wagons. This knowledge would be incorporated into the concentrated trail segments as the Oregon Trail took its early shape. Now, Pacific Fur Company partner Robert Stewart led a small group of men back east to report to his store. The group planned to retrace this path, followed by the overland expedition, back up to the east following the Columbia and Snake Rivers. Fear of Native American attacks near Union Pass in Wyoming forced the group further south, where they discovered the South Pass, a wide and easy pass over the Continental Divide. The party continued east via the Sweetwater River, North Platte River, where they spent the winter, and Platte River on the Missouri River, finally arriving in St. Louis in the spring of 1813. The route they had used appeared to be potentially a practical wagon route, requiring minimal improvements, and Stewart's journal provided a meticulous account of most of the route. Because of the War of 1812 and the lack of U.S. fur trading posts in the Pacific Northwest, most of the route was unused for more than 10 years. Well, in August of 1811, 3 months after Fort Astoria was established, David Thompson and his team of British Northwest Company explorers came floating down the Columbia to Fort Astoria. He had just completed a journey through most of western Canada and most of the Columbia River drainage system. He was mapping the country for possible fur trading posts. Along the way, he camped at the confluence of the Columbia and Snake Rivers and posted a notice claiming the land for Britain and stating the intention of the Northwest Company to build a fort on the site. Fort Nez Perce was later established there. I love how people just walked up and planted a sign saying, "This is mine."
I want to do that.
And of course, the other great question is, with planting a sign claiming this area, in this case for Britain, how far wide is that sign supposedly laying claim to? 50 miles, 100 miles across?
As much as I want.
Obviously, as far as I can throw a stone.
I can throw not very far.
Yeah. Astor, concerned the British Navy would seize their forts and supplies in the War of 1812, sold to the Northwest Company in 1812 their forts, supplies, and furs on the Columbia and Snake River. The Northwest Company started establishing more forts and trading posts of its own. By 1821, when armed hostilities broke out with the Hudson's Bay Company rivals, the Northwest Company was pressured by the British governments to merge with the HBC. The HBC had nearly a complete monopoly on trading and most governing issues in the Columbia District, or Oregon Country as it was referred to by the Americans, also the Rupert's Land. That year, the British Parliament passed a statute applying the laws of Upper Canada to the district and giving the HBC power to enforce those laws. From 1812 to 1840, the British, through the HBC, had nearly complete control of the Pacific Northwest and the western half of the Oregon Trail. In theory, by the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812, restored possession of the Oregon Territory to the United States. Joint occupation, as the region was formally established by the Anglo-American Convention of 1818, the British, through the HBC, tried to discourage any U.S. trappers, traders, and settlers from work or settlement in the Pacific Northwest. By overland travel, American missionaries and early settlers, initially mostly ex-trappers, started showing up in Oregon around 1824, although officially the HBC discouraged settlement because it interfered with the lucrative fur trade. The chief factor at Fort Vancouver, John McLaughlin, gave substantial help, including employment, until they could get established. In the early 1840s, thousands of American settlers arrived and soon greatly outnumbered the British settlers in Oregon. McLaughlin, despite working for the HBC, gave help in the form of loans, medical care, shelter, clothing, food supplies, and seed to the U.S. immigrants. These new immigrants often arrived in Oregon tired, worn out, nearly penniless, with insufficient food or supplies, just as winter was coming on. McLaughlin would later be hailed as the father of Oregon.
Oregon!
Now, the York Express factory, establishing another route to the Oregon Territory, evolved from an earlier express brigade used by the Northwest Company between Fort Astoria and Fort William, Ontario, on Lake Superior. By 1825, the HBC started using two brigades, each setting out from opposite ends of the express route, one from Fort Vancouver on the Columbia River, the other from the York factory on Hudson Bay, in spring and passing each other in the middle of the continent. This established a quick, about 100 days for 2,600 miles one way, to resupply the forts and fur trading centers, as well as collecting the furs and posts that had been brought and transmitting messages between Fort Vancouver and the York factory on the Hudson Bay. Now, the HBC built a much larger Fort Vancouver in 1824, slightly upstream from Fort Astoria, on the north side of the Columbia River. They were hoping the Columbia would be the future U.S.-Canada border. The fort quickly became the center of activity in the Pacific Northwest. Each year, ships would come in from London to the Pacific via Cape Horn to drop off supplies and trade goods in its trading posts in the Pacific Northwest, and then pick up accumulated furs used to pay for these supplies. It was the nexus of the fur trade on the Pacific coast. Its influence reached from the Rocky Mountains to the Hawaiian Islands, and from Russia and Alaska into the Mexican-controlled California. At its pinnacle, about 1840, Fort Vancouver and its factor, or manager, watched over 34 outposts, 24 ports, 6 ships, and about 600 employees. When the American immigration over the Oregon Trail began in earnest about the early 1840s, for many of these settlers, the fort became the last stop on the Oregon Trail where they could get supplies, aid, and help before starting the homesteads. Fort Vancouver was the main resupply point for nearly all of the Oregon Trail travelers until U.S. towns could be established. The HBC established Fort Colville in 1825 on the Columbia River near Kettle Falls as a good site to collect furs and control the upper Columbia River fur trade. Fort Nisqually was built near the present town of DuPont, Washington, and was the first HBC fort on the Puget Sound. Fort Victoria was erected in 1843 and became the headquarters of operations in British Columbia, eventually growing to the modern-day Victoria, the capital of British Columbia. And by 1840, the HBC had 3 forts: Fort Hall, purchased from Nathaniel Jarvis Wythe in 1837, Fort Boise, and Fort Nez Perce on the western edge of the Oregon Trail route, as well as Fort Vancouver near its terminus in the Willamette Valley. With minor exceptions, they all gave substantial and often desperately needed aid to the early Oregon Trail pioneers. Well, when the fur trade slowed in 1840 because of fashion changes in men's hats, the value of the Pacific Northwest to the British was seriously diminished. Canada had fewer potential settlers who were willing to move more than 2,500 miles to the Pacific Northwest. Although several hundred ex-trappers, British and American, and their families did start settling in Oregon, Washington, and California, they used most of the York Express route through northern Canada. In 1841, James Sinclair, on orders from Sir George Simpson, guided nearly 200 settlers from the Red River Colony, located at the junction of the Assabon River and Red River near present Winnipeg and Manitoba in Canada, into the Oregon Territory. This attempted settlement failed when most of the families joined the settlers in Willamette Valley with their promise of free land and HBC-free government. In 1846, the Oregon Treaty ending the Oregon boundary dispute was signed with Britain. Britain lost the land north of the Columbia River they had so long controlled. The new Canada-United States border was established much further north at the 49th parallel. This treaty granted the HBC navigation rights on the Columbia River for supplying their fur trade posts, clear titles to the trading post properties, allowing them to be sold later if they wanted, and left the British with good anchorages at Vancouver and Victoria. It gave the United States what it mostly wanted, a reasonable boundary and good anchorage on the west coast in the Puget Sound. While there was almost no United States settlers in the future state of Washington in 1846, the United States had already demonstrated it could induce thousands of settlers to go to the Oregon Territory, and that it would be only a short time before they would vastly outnumber the few hundred HBC employees and retirees living in Washington. Now, reports dating back to 1806 from Lieutenant Zebulon Pike and 1819 by Major Stephen Long described the Great Plains as, quote, unfit for human habitation and as the Great American Desert. These descriptions were mainly based on a relative lack of timber and surface water. Images of sandy wastelands conjured up terms like desert and were tempered by the reports of vast herds of millions of plains bison that somehow managed to live in this desert. In the 1840s, the Great Plains appeared as unattractive for settlement and were illegal for homesteading until well after 1846. Initially, it was set aside by the U.S. government for the Native American settlers. Now, the next available land for general settlement, Oregon, appeared to be free for the taking and had fertile lands, disease-free climate. Yellow fever and malaria were more prevalent in much of the Missouri River and Mississippi River drainage. And extensive uncut, unclaimed forests, big rivers, potential seaports, and only a few nominally British settlers. Fur trappers, often working with fur traders, followed nearly all possible streams looking for beaver in the years 1812 to 1840, when the fur trade was active. Fur traders like Manuel Lisa, Robert Stewart, William H. Ashley, Jedediah Smith, William Sublett, Kit Carson, Andrew Henry, Jim Bridger, Peter Ogden, David Thompson, James Douglas. Several of these mountain men would, make a pretty tidy sum off of pelts. Besides describing and naming many of the rivers of the mountains of the Intermountain West and Pacific Northwest, they often kept diaries of their travels and were available as guides and consultants when the trail started to become open for general travel. The fur trade would wind down to a very low level just as the Oregon Trail traffic seriously began about 1840. Now, Jedediah Smith in 1823 and Thomas Fitzpatrick led their trapping crew south from the Yellowstone River to the Sweetwater River. They were looking for a safe location to spend the winter. Smith reasoned that the Sweetwater flowed east. It must eventually run into the Missouri River. Trying to transport their extensive fur collection down the Sweetwater and the North Platte River, they found a near disastrous canoe crash that the rivers were too swift and rough for their water passage. On the 4th of July, 1824, they cached their furs under the dome of rock that they named Independence Rock and started their long trek on foot to the Missouri River. Upon arriving back in the settled area, they brought pack horses on credit and retrieved their furs, and they had rediscovered the route that Robert Stewart had taken in 1813, 11 years prior. Thomas Fitzpatrick was often hired as a guide. When the fur trade dwindled in 1840, Smith was killed by Comanche natives around 1831. Up to 3,000 mountain men were trappers and explorers employed by both British and United States fur companies or working as free trappers who roamed the North American Rocky Mountains from about 1810 to the early 1840s. They usually traveled in small groups for mutual support and protection. Trapping took place in the fall when the fur became prime. Mountain men primarily trapped beaver and sold the skins. A good beaver skin could bring it to $4 at a time when a man's wages was often $1 a day. Some were more interested in exploring the West, and in 1825 the first significant American rendezvous occurred at Henry's Fork of the Green River. Now, the trading supplies were brought in by a large party using pack trains originating on the Missouri River, and these pack trains were often used to haul out fur bales. They normally used the north side of the Platte River, the same route used 20 years later by the Mormon Trail. And for the next 15 years, the American Rendezvous was an annual event moving to different locations, usually somewhere on the Green River in the future state of Wyoming. Each rendezvous, occurring during the slack summer period, allowed fur traders to trade for and collect the furs from the trappers and their Native American allies without having the expense of building or maintaining a fort or wintering over in the cold Rockies. In only a few weeks of the rendezvous, a year's worth of trading and celebrating would take place as the fur traders took their furs and their remaining supplies back east for the winter, and the trappers faced another fall and winter with new supplies. Kind of like a, what do you want to call it, the Central States Fair, but nothing but a bunch of mountain men swapping equipment and stories. Now, Trapper Jim Beckworth,
Of some sort.
yeah, Trapper Jim Beckworth described the scene as one of mirth, songs, dancing, shouting, trading, running, jumping, singing, racing, target shooting, yarns, frolic with all sorts of extravagance that white men or Indians could invent. In 1830, William Sublette brought the first wagons carrying his trading goods up the Platte, North Platte, and Sweetwater rivers before crossing over the South Pass to a fur trade rendezvous on the Green River near the future town of Big Piney, Wyoming. He had a crew that dug out the gullies and the river crossings and cleared the brush when needed. This established the eastern part of most of the Oregon Trail was passable by wagons. In the late 1830s, the HBC instituted a policy intended to destroy or weaken the American Fur Trade Company. The HBC's annual collection and resupply of the Snake River Expedition was transformed to a trading enterprise. Beginning in 1834, it visited the American Rendezvous to undersell the American traders, losing money but undercutting the American fur traders. By 1840, the fashion in Europe and Britain shifted away from the formerly very popular beaver felt hats, and prices for furs rapidly declined and trapping almost ceased. Now, fur traders tried to use the Platte River, the main route of the eastern Oregon Trail, for transport, but soon gave up in frustration as its many channels and islands, combined with its muddy waters, were too shallow, crooked, and unpredictable to use for water transport. The Platte also proved to be unnavigable. The Platte River and North Platte River Valley, however, became an easy roadway for wagons, with its nearly flat plain sloping easily up and heading almost due west. There were several U.S. government-sponsored explorers who explored part of the Oregon Trail and wrote extensively about this operation. Captain Benjamin Bonneville, in his expedition of 1832 to 34, explored much of the Oregon Trail and brought wagons up the Platte, North Platte, Sweetwater route across the South Pass to the Green River in Wyoming. He explored most of the Idaho and Oregon Trail to the Columbia. This account of his explorations in the West were published by Washington Irving in 1838. John C. Fremont of the U.S. Army Corps of Topographical Engineers and his guide Kit Carson led 3 expeditions from 1842 to 1846 over parts of California and Oregon. His explorations were written up by him and his wife, Jessie Benton Fremont, and were widely published. The first detailed map of the California and Oregon were drawn by Fremont and his topographers and cartographers in about 1848. Now, in 1834, the Dales Methodist Mission was founded by Reverend Jason Lee just east of Mount Hood on the Columbia River. In 1836, Henry Spalding and Marcus Whitman traveled west to establish their Whitman Mission near modern-day Walla Walla, Washington. The party included the wives of 2 men, Narcia Whitman and Eliza Hart Spalding, who became the first European-American women to cross the Rocky Mountains. En route, the party accompanied American fur traders going to the 1836 rendezvous on the Green River in Wyoming, and then joined Hudson's Bay Company fur traders traveling west to Fort Nez Perce. also called Fort Walla Walla. This group was the first wagon to travel all the way to Fort Hall, where the wagons were abandoned at the urging of the guides. They used pack animals for the rest of the trip to Fort Walla Walla, and then floated by boat to Fort Vancouver to get supplies before returning to start their missions. Other missionaries, mostly husband and wives teams using wagon and pack trains, established missions in the Willamette Valley, as well as other various locations in the future states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Now, on May 1st, 1839, a group of 18 men from Peoria, Illinois, set out with the intention of colonizing the Oregon country on behalf of the United States of America to drive out the HBC operating there. The men of the Peoria Party were among the first pioneers to traverse most of the Oregon Trail. They were initially led by Thomas J. Farnham and called themselves the Oregon Dragoons. They carried a large flag emblazoned with the motto, Oregon or the Grave. Although the group split up near Bent's Fort on the South Platte, and Farnham was disposed of as leader, 9 of the members actually did reach Oregon. In September of 1840, Robert Newell, Joseph L. Meek, and their families reached Fort Walla Walla with their 3 wagons that they had driven from Fort Hall. The wagons were the first to reach the Columbia River overland, and they opened the final leg of the Oregon Trail to wagon traffic. In 1841, the Burleson-Bidwell Party were the first immigrant group credited with using the Oregon Trail to immigrate west. The group set out for California, but about half the party left the original group at Soda Springs, Idaho, and proceeded to the Willamette Valley in Oregon, leaving their wagons at Fort Hall. On May 16, 1846, a second organized wagon train set out from Elm Grove, Missouri, with more than 100 pioneers. The party was led by Elijah White, and the group broke up after passing Fort Hall, with most of the single men hurrying ahead with their families following later. Bye, guys.
Goodbye.
Now, 1843 was dubbed the Great Year of Migration, or the Wagon Train of 1843, an estimated 700 to 1,000 immigrants left for Oregon. They were led initially by John Gant, a former U.S. Army captain and fur trader who was contracted to guide the train to Fort Hall for $1 a person. The winter before, Marcus Whitman had made a brutal midwinter trip from Oregon to St. Louis to appeal a decision by his mission backers to abandon several of the Oregon missions. He joined the wagon train at the Platte River for his return trip when the pioneers were told at Fort Hall by agents from the Hudson's Bay Company that they should abandon their wagons there and use pack animals for the rest of the way. Whitman disagreed and volunteered to lead the wagons to Oregon. He believed that wagon trains were large enough that they could build whatever road improvements that they needed to make the trip with their wagons.
Yeah, sure, that's a thing.
Yeah. The biggest obstacle that they faced in the Blue Mountains was in the Blue Mountains of Oregon, where they had to cut and clear a trail through heavy timber. The wagons were stopped at the Dalles in Oregon by the lack of road around Mount Hood. The wagons had to be disassembled and floated down the treacherous Columbia River, and the animals herded over through the rough Lolo Trail to get by Mount Hood. Nearly all of the settlers in the 1843 wagon trains arrived at the Willamette Valley in early October. A passable wagon trail now existed from the Missouri River to the Dalles. Now, Jesse Applegate's account of this immigration, A Day with the Cow column in 1843, had been described as the best bit of literature left to us by any participant of the Oregon pioneer movement, and has been republished several times from 1868 to 1990. In 1846, the Barlow Road was completed around Mount Hood, providing a rough but completely passable wagon trail from the Missouri River by the Willamette Valley of about 2,000 miles. Now, in 1843, settlers of the Willamette Valley drafted the Organic Laws of Oregon, organizing land claims within the Oregon County. Married couples were granted at no cost except for the requirement to work and improve the land of up to 640 acres, a section of a square mile, and the unmarried settlers could claim 320 acres. As a group was a provisional government with no authority, these claims were not valid under the United States or British law, but they were eventually honored by the United States in the Donation Land Act of 1850. The Donation Land Act provided for married settlers to be granted 320 acres and unmarried settlers 160 acres. Following the expiration of the act in 1854, the land was no longer free, but cost $1.25 per acre, with a limit of 320 acres, the same as most unimproved government land. Now, consensus of interpretations, as found by John Ferreter's book Women and the Men of the Overland Trail, held that men and women's power within marriage was uneven. This meant that women did not experience the trail as liberated, but instead only found harder work than they had handled back east. However, feminist scholarship by historians such as Lillian Schissel, Sandra Myers, and Glenda Riley suggests men and women did not view the West and Western migration the same way. Whereas men might deem the dangers of the trail acceptable if there was a strong economic reward at the end, women viewed these dangers as threatening to the stability and survival of the family. Once they arrived at the new Western home, women's public role in the building Western communities and participating in the Western economy gave them a greater authority than they'd known back east. There was a female frontier that was distinct and different than that experienced by men. Women's diaries kept during their travels and letters they wrote home once they arrived at their destination supports these contentions. Women wrote with sadness and concern at the number of deaths along the trail. Anna Maria King wrote to her family in 1845 about her trip to the Lackawanna Valley, Oregon, and of the multiple deaths experienced by her traveling group. But listen to these deaths. Sally Chambers, John King and his wife, their little daughter Electa, and their babe, their son 9 months old. Nancy C. Norton's sister are gone. Mr. A. Fuller lost his wife and daughter Tabitha. 8 of our 2 families have gone to their long home. Similarly, immigrant Martha Gay Masterson, who traveled the trail with her family at the age of 13, mentioned the fascination she and other children felt for the graves and loose skulls they would find near their camps. Anna Marie King, like many other women, also advised family and friends back home of the realities of the trip and offered advice on how to prepare for the trip. Women often reacted and responded, often enthusiastically, to the landscape of the West. Betsy Bailey, in a letter to her sister, Lucy P. Griffith, described how travelers responded to the new environment they encountered. The mountains looked like volcanoes, and the appearance that one day there would be an awful thundering of volcanoes and a burning world. The valleys were all covered with a white crust and looked like slatras, some of the company used to raise their bread. Now, along the same trail, the Mormon Trail followed the same pattern for a distance, following prosecution and mob action in Missouri, Illinois, and other states, and the assassination of the prophet Joseph Smith in 1844. Mormon leader Brigham Young and led settlers in the Latter-day Saints Church west of Salt Lake Valley in the present-day Utah. In 1847, Young led a small, fast-moving group from their winter quarters encampments near Omaha, Nebraska, and their approximately 50 temporary settlements on the Missouri River in Iowa, including Council Bluffs. About 2,200 LDS pioneers went that first year, and they were charged with establishing farms, growing crops, building fences and herds, and establishing preliminary settlements to feed and support many thousands of immigrants expected in the coming years. After ferrying across the Missouri River and establishing wagon trains near what became Omaha, Mormons followed the northern bank of the Platte River to Nebraska, to Fort Laramie, in present-day Wyoming. They initially started out in 1848 with trains of several thousand immigrants, which were rapidly split into smaller groups to be more easily accommodated at the limited springs and acceptable camping places on the trail. The much larger presence of women and children meant that these wagon trains did not try to cover as much ground in a single day as the Oregon and California bound immigrants, typically taking about 100 days to cover the 1,000 miles trip to Salt Lake City. Now, the Oregon and California immigrants averaged about 15 miles per day. In Wyoming, the Mormon immigrants followed the main Oregon-California Mormon Trail through Wyoming to Fort Bridger. That's where they split off from the main trail and followed and improved the rough path through the Hastings Cutoff used by the ill-fated Donner Party in 1846.
Oops.
Now, between 1847 and 1860, over 43,000 Mormon settlers and tens of thousands of travelers on the California Trail and the Oregon Trail followed Young to Utah. And after 1848, the travelers headed to California, Oregon, resupplied at the Salt Lake Valley, then went back over the Salt Lake Cutoff, rejoining the trail near the future Idaho-Utah border at the city of Roxon, Idaho. Along the Mormon Trail, the Mormon pioneers established a number of ferries and made trail improvements to help later travelers earn much-needed money. One of the better-known ferries was the Mormon Ferry across the North Platte near the future site of Fort Casper in Wyoming, which operated between 1848 and 1852, and the Green River Ferry near Fort Bridger, which operated from 1847 to 1856. The ferries are free for Mormon settlers, while all others were charged a toll ranging from $3 to $8. Now, in January of 1848, James Marshall found gold in the Sierra Nevada portion of the American River, sparking the California Gold Rush. It's estimated that two-thirds of the male population of Oregon went to California in 1848 to cash in on this opportunity. To get there, they helped build the Lassen branch of the Applegate-Lassen Trail by cutting a wagon train through extensive forests. Many returned with significant gold, which helped jumpstart the Oregon economy. Over the next decade, gold seekers from the Midwestern United States and the East Coast of the United States dramatically increased traffic along the Oregon and California trails. These 49ers often chose to speed over safety and opted to use shortcuts such as the sublet Greenwood Cutoff in Wyoming, which reduced the time by almost 7 days but spanned nearly 45 miles of desert without water, grass, or fuel for fires.
That was smart.
Oh, yeah. In 1849 was the first year of the large-scale cholera epidemics in the United States. Thousands were thought to have died on the trail on their way to California, most buried in unmarked graves in Kansas and Nebraska. The adjusted 1850 census of the United States showed California this rush was overwhelmingly male, with about 112,000 males to 8,000 females, with about 5,500 women over age 15. Women were significantly underrepresented in the California gold rush, and sex ratios did not reach essential equality in California and other states in the West until about 1950. The relative scarcity of women gave them many opportunities to do more things that were not normally considered women's work in this era. After 1849, the California gold rush continued for several years as miners continued to find about $50 million worth of gold each year at $21 per ounce. Once California was established as a prosperous state, many thousands more immigrated there each year for the opportunities. Now, the trail was still in use during the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, but traffic declined after 1855 when the Panama Railroad across the Isthmus of Panama was completed. Paddle wheel steamships and sailing ships, often heavily subsidized to carry the mail, provided rapid transport to and from the East Coast and New Orleans, Louisiana, and to and from Panama to ports in California and Oregon. Over the years, many ferries were established to help get across the many rivers in the path of the Oregon Trail. Multiple ferries were established on the Missouri River, Kansas River, Little Blue River, Elkhorn River, Loup River, Platte River, South Platte River, North Platte River, Laramie River, Green River, Bear River, two crossings of the Snake River, John Day River, Deschutes River, Columbia River, as well as many other smaller streams. During peak immigration periods, several ferries on any given river often competed for pioneer dollars. These ferries significantly increased speed and safety for Oregon Trail travelers. They increased the cost of traveling on the trail by about $30 per wagon, but decreased the speed of the transit from about 160 to 170 days to 120 to 140 days in just a short 17 years. Ferries also helped prevent deaths by drowning at river crossings. In April of 1859, an expedition of the U.S. Corps of Topographical Engineers, led by Captain James H. Simpson, left Camp Floyd, Utah, to establish an Army supply route across the Great Basin to the eastern slope of the Sierras. Upon return in early August, Simpson reported that he had surveyed the central overland route from Camp Floyd to Genoa, Nevada. This route went through central Nevada, roughly where U.S. Route 50 goes today, and it was about 280 miles shorter than the standard Humboldt River California Trail route. The Army improved this trail for use by wagons and stagecoaches in 1859 and 1860, Starting in 1860, the American Civil War closed the heavily subsidized Butterfield Overland Mail Stage southern route through the desert of the American Southwest. In 1860 and 61, the Pony Express showed up.
Pony Express?
Legends on those guys. Employing riders traveling horseback day and night with relay stations every 10 miles to supply fresh horses, was established from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. The Pony Express built many of their eastern stations along the Oregon, California, Mormon, Bozeman trails, and many of their western stations along the very sparsely settled central route through Utah and Nevada. The Pony Express delivered mail summer and winter in roughly 10 days from the Midwest to California.
Faster than it is now.
Yeah, and a lot more reliable. In 1861, John Butterfield, who since 1858 had been using the Butterfield Overland Mail, also switched to the central route to avoid traveling through hostile territories during the American Civil War. George Shorpening immediately realized the value of this more direct route, shifting his existing mail and passenger line along the stations from the northern route, California Trail, along the Humboldt River. In 1861, the first transcontinental telegraph also laid its lines alongside the central overland route. Several stage lines were sent up along carrying mail and passengers off the trail much of the route of the original Oregon Trail to Fort Bridger, and from there over the central overland route to California. By traveling day and night with many stations and changes of teams and extensive mail subsidies, these stages could get passengers and mail from the Midwest to California in about 25 to 28 days, a lot shorter of a route. These combined stages and Pony Express stations along the Oregon Trail and central route through Utah and Nevada were joined by the first transcontinental telegraph stations and telegraph line, which followed much of the same route in 1861 from Carson City, Nevada, to Salt Lake City. The Pony Express folded the same year it was founded, as they failed to receive the expected mail contract from the U.S. government, and the telegraph filled in the need for rapid east-west communication. The combination wagon, stagecoach, Pony Express telegraph line route is labeled the Pony Express National Historic Trail on the National Trail Map. From Salt Lake City, the telegraph line follows much of the Mormon, California, Oregon trails to Omaha, Nebraska. And after the first transcontinental railroad was completed in 1869, telegraph lines usually followed the railroad tracks to the required relay stations. Telegraph lines were much easier to maintain alongside the tracks. Telegraph lines to unpopulated areas were largely abandoned.
Oh no.
As the years passed, though, the Oregon Trail became a heavily used corridor from the Missouri River to the Columbia River. Offshoots of the trail continued to grow as gold and silver discoveries, farming, lumbering, ranching, and business opportunities resulted in much more traffic to these areas. Traffic became two-directional as towns were established along the trail, and by 1870 the population in the states served by the Oregon Trail and its offshoots increased by about 350,000 people over the 1860 census levels.
Fun.
Yeah, with the exception of most of the 180,000 people increasing in California, most of the people living away from the coast traveled through parts of the Oregon Trail and its many extensions and cutoffs to get to their new residences. Even before the famous Texas cattle drives after the Civil War, the trail was being used to drive herds of thousands of cattle, horses, sheep, and goats from the Midwest to various towns and cities along the trails. According to studies by trail historian John Unruh, the livestock that may have been as plentiful or more plentiful than the immigrants of many years, in 1852 there were records of a 1,500 turkey drive from Illinois to California.
That must have been interesting to see.
Oh, I bet it was. The main reason for this livestock traffic was the large cost discrepancy between livestock in the Midwest and at the end of the trail in California, Oregon, and Montana. They could often be bought in the Midwest for about 1/3 to 1/10 of what they would fetch at the end of the trail. Large losses could occur, and the drovers would still make significant profits. There was a story I remember reading of a fellow who wanted to take turkeys from eastern South Dakota to Deadwood.
Huh?
And he actually crossed the Missouri River with, if I remember right, 2 or 3 dozen turkeys. By the time he finally made it to Deadwood, I guess he had like 6 left.
Well,
All the things in the western South Dakota.
there are a lot of things to eat wild turkeys.
Yeah. But, he figured he was going to make a profit if he could get that far. And, he made it. I don't know how much of a profit he made then, but... Well, as the immigrant travel on the trail declined in later years and after livestock ranches had established at many places along the trail, large herds of animals were often driven along part of the trail to get to and from markets. Now, with the first transcontinental railroad being completed in 1869, providing faster, safer, and usually cheaper travel east and west, the journey took 7 days and cost as little as $65, equivalent to $1,323 in 2021. Some immigrants continued to use the trail well into the 1890s, and modern highways and railroads eventually paralleled large portions of the trail, including U.S. Highway 26, Interstate 84 in Oregon and Idaho, and Interstate 80 in Nebraska. Contemporary interest in the overland trek has prompted states and federal government to preserve landmarks on the trail, including wagon ruts, buildings, and registers where immigrants carved their names. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, there have been a number of reenactments of the trek, with participants wearing period garments and traveling by wagon. But
that would be fun, but I don't think I have the patience or the skills for it.
Yeah, or the spine, given how much those wagons bounced around back in the day.
That too.
But you look at what the Oregon Trail did to help the country grow east to west. It's kind of amazing, what the people had to go through. Not only the fact that they were setting out to start a new life. A lot of these people had different reasons to make the travel. Some of them, just like when they came into the Black Hills, they were going out to California for the gold, And apparently quite a number of them did rather well because they were able to help settle and stabilize the places up in Oregon. But when you look at all the people that were using those trails, even to this day, it's part of what we do now anymore. Is everybody loves to travel. We love to get in the cars. We love to just go drive. It's call it wanderlust. Call it the habit of just liking to get out. And so we're just kind of following in their footsteps. But
no way, no, just kidding.
Yeah. This is the Bearded Historian. I'll give you guys a little history page. The Oregon Trail, also a very good video game. Highly recommend it. There's a new copy coming out. But you folks have a good day, and we will see you on Thursday. Have a good one.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Wait.